The distress call crackled through the radio at 4:17 a.m., cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a knife through silk. Mayday, mayday, this is Coast Guard Station Kodiak. We have a commercial fishing vessel taking on water 47 miles northwest of Shuyak Island. 8 souls aboard, including 2 children. Vessel is listing heavily to starboard. We need immediate air rescue before she goes down. The voice on the other end was steady but urgent. Roger, Kodiak. This is Rescue Coordination Center Anchorage. We're scrambling our HH-60 Jayhawk from Air Station Kodiak. ETA to your location approximately 35 minutes. But 35 minutes was a lifetime too long. The fishing vessel Northern Pride had struck a submerged log during the night, tearing a gash in her hull below the waterline. Captain Mike Torino and his crew had been fighting the rising water for 2 hours, but the manual bilge pumps were losing the battle against the relentless sea. His wife Maria huddled in the wheelhouse with their 7-year-old daughter Sophia and 9-year-old son Carlos, while 4 crew members worked frantically to keep the vessel afloat. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. What had started as a calm night was transforming into something much more dangerous. Winds were building from the southwest at 25 knots with gusts to 35. Visibility was dropping as fog rolled in from the deeper waters of the Gulf of Alaska. Wave heights were climbing to 8 feet and growing. The Northern Pride, already compromised by the hull breach, was taking a beating from the increasingly violent CDOT at Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak. The alarm klaxon shattered the early morning quiet. The rescue crew rushed to their HH-6 Jayhawk helicopter, running through pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. But as Pilot Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison began his engine start sequence, a grinding noise echoed from the aircraft's transmission. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit like a Christmas tree. The primary rescue helicopter was down with a mechanical failure that would take hours to repair. The backup aircraft told a similar story. During a training flight the previous evening, the second HH-6O had experienced a hydraulic system failure that grounded it indefinitely. The maintenance crew was still waiting for replacement parts that wouldn't arrive until the following week. For the first time in anyone's memory, Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak was without a single operational rescue helicopter. The base commander, Captain Robert Chun, felt the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders as he surveyed the hangar. 8 people were about to die in the frigid waters of the North Pacific, and he had no way to reach them. The nearest Coast Guard air asset was 3 hours away in Sitka, far too distant to matter. The Navy had no helicopters in the region. The Army National Guard's aircraft were committed to a search and rescue operation on the other side of the state. That's when Chief Petty, Officer Danny Rodriguez, remembered something his grandfather had told him about the old days, back when the Coast Guard flew ancient machines held together by prayer and determination. "Sir," he said to Captain Chun, "there's an old Huey sitting in the back of Hangar 3. Been there since before I was stationed here. I think it belongs to some local woman who does charter flights." Captain Chun's eyebrows raised. "A civilian aircraft? On a Coast Guard base?" "Yes, sir. She's got some kind of special arrangement. Uses it for medical evacuations and supply runs to remote villages. The bird's been here for maintenance work, but the owner couldn't afford to fix it up to commercial standards. It's been sitting there for about 8 months now." The captain's mind raced through the possibilities. A civilian helicopter might be their only option, but who could fly it? The Coast Guard pilots were all trained on modern aircraft with sophisticated systems. The old Huey was from a different era entirely, with mechanical controls and analog instruments that today's aviators had never seen outside of a museum. "Who owns this helicopter?" Chin asked. "Woman named Becca Thornton. Local pilot, maybe 60 years old. Lives in a cabin about 10 miles from here. People call her the Bird Lady because she's always flying around in that old rust bucket." The Northern Pride was sending increasingly desperate radio calls. The water was now knee-deep in the engine compartment, and the vessel was listing at a dangerous angle. Captain Torino's voice was strained as he reported their position and condition. Coast Guard, this is Northern Pride. We're taking on water faster than we can pump it out. I don't think we can stay afloat much longer. My family is aboard. Please hurry. Captain Chun made a command decision that would either save 8 lives or end his career. Rodriguez, get me this Rebecca Thornton on the phone, now. The call went through to a weathered cabin perched on a bluff overlooking Chiniac Bay. Rebecca. Thornton had been awake for hours, listening to the marine radio traffic and following the developing emergency. At 64 years old, she had silver hair streaked with stubborn remnants of auburn, pulled back in a practical bun. Her hands, scarred from decades of mechanical work, were wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee as she stared out at the storm-tossed waters. When the phone rang, she answered on the first ring. This is Becca. Miss Thornton, this is Captain Chun from Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak. We have an emergency situation, and we need to discuss your helicopter. Becca's voice was steady, tinged with a slight southern accent that 40 years in Alaska hadn't quite erased. I heard the radio traffic, Captain. The Northern Pride. And I'm guessing your birds are down, or you wouldn't be calling me. That's correct. We need to know if your aircraft is airworthy for an emergency rescue mission. There was a pause on the line. Becca had been expecting this call for 8 months, ever since her beloved UH-1 H. Huey had been grounded for maintenance issues she couldn't afford to fix. The helicopter had been her life for 2 decades, but age and finances had finally caught up with both of them. Captain, I'll be honest with you. She's not pretty, and she's not certified for commercial operations. The engine has some hours on it, and the avionics are older than your youngest pilot. But she fly, and she get the job done if you need her to. Can you get here quickly? We're running out of time. I'm already putting on my boots, Captain. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Becca hung up the phone and moved with the efficiency of someone who had answered emergency calls for most of her adult life. She pulled on insulated coveralls, grabbed her flight helmet from its hook by the door, and collected her logbooks and charts. As she drove her battered pickup truck toward the Coast Guard base, she thought about the helicopter that had been her constant companion for so many years. The UH-1H had been built in 1972, during the height of the Vietnam War. It had served with distinction in Southeast Asia before being transferred to civilian use in the 1980s. Becca had purchased it from a government surplus auction in 1995, using her life savings and a loan secured against her cabin. For 25 years, she had flown mercy missions throughout rural Alaska, delivering medical supplies to remote villages, evacuating sick patients to hospitals, and providing transportation when weather made road travel impossible. But time and financial reality had finally grounded her. The helicopter needed a major engine overhaul, updated avionics, and countless small repairs that would cost more than the aircraft was worth. She had been forced to accept that her flying days were over, that the bird she loved would spend its final years as a static display or spare part source. The Coast Guard base was a hive of activity when she arrived. Vehicles with flashing lights moved between buildings, and personnel ran through the pre-dawn darkness with purposeful urgency. Becca drove directly to Hangar 3, where she found Captain Chen and several other Coast Guard officers standing around her helicopter. The UH-1H looked every bit of its 50 years. The olive drab paint was faded and chipped, revealing primer and metal underneath. Rust streaks marked the fuselage where decades of coastal weather had taken their toll. The rotor blades showed the scars of countless hours in harsh conditions. To the Coast Guard personnel, it looked like a museum piece that belonged in a scrapyard. Miss Thornton, Captain Chun said as she approached, I have to ask you directly. Can this aircraft safely conduct a rescue mission in current weather conditions? Becca walked around the helicopter, her trained eye taking in details that others. She checked the tail rotor, examined the engine compartment, and peered at the transmission housing. Her hands moved over the aircraft with the familiarity of a mother checking her child for fever. "She's not pretty, Captain, but she's sound. The engine has about 400 hours since the last major overhaul. The transmission was rebuilt 3 years ago. The flight controls are all mechanical, no hydraulic assists, so there's less that can go wrong. The avionics are basic, but they work. Should get you to that fishing boat and back." Lieutenant Commander Morrison, the Coast Guard pilot, whose own helicopter had failed, looked at the ancient machine with obvious skepticism. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I've never flown anything like this. Our aircraft have GPS navigation, weather radar, automatic flight controls. This thing looks like it belongs in a museum." Becca's eyes met his with a steady gaze. "Son, I've been flying helicopters since before you were born. I learned on machines just like this one. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." Captain Chun looked at his watch. The Northern Pride had been taking on water for over 3 hours. Every minute of delay reduced the chances of a successful rescue. "Miss Thornton, I have to ask, are you volunteering to fly this mission?" The question hung in the air like morning fog. Everyone in the hangar understood the implications. This was not a routine flight. The weather was deteriorating, the aircraft was old and unproven, and 8 lives hung in the balance. Any pilot who accepted this mission would be risking everything. Becca looked at the faces around her, then back at her helicopter. She thought about the children aboard the Northern Pride, huddled in terror as their world tilted and filled with water. She thought about the crew members fighting to keep their vessel afloat, and the captain whose family faced death in the dark waters of the North Pacific. "I can fly it," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of decades, of experience and absolute conviction. There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt about her ability to complete the mission. She had made a decision that would change everything for 8 people who were running out of time. Lieutenant Commander Morrison couldn't help himself. A short laugh escaped his lips. "Ma'am, I appreciate your confidence, but this is a complex rescue operation in deteriorating weather conditions. We're talking about precision flying in challenging circumstances. That helicopter hasn't flown in 8 months. Other Coast Guard personnel began to murmur among themselves. The idea of a 64-year-old civilian woman flying a decrepit helicopter on a life-or-death rescue mission seemed almost absurd. Someone pulled out a phone to record what they assumed would be an embarrassing moment when reality set in. "Becca," Chief Rodriguez said gently, "maybe we should wait for the Sitka bird to get here. I know you mean well, but this isn't a milk run to some village. This is serious business." But Becca wasn't listening to the skepticism. She was already moving toward the helicopter, her hands checking external connections and safety equipment. She had heard the doubt in their voices before, from officials who couldn't understand how someone who looked like a grandmother could handle complex aviation missions. She pulled the pilot's door open and climbed into the left seat. The interior of the Huey was Spartanly functional, with worn fabric seats and instrument panels that had seen decades of use. But as her hands found the controls, something changed in her demeanor. The slight stoop in her shoulders straightened. Her movements became crisp and purposeful. "Chief Rodriguez," she called out, "I need you to pull the wheel chocks and clear the area around the aircraft." "Captain Chun, I need authorization to launch on a Coast Guard rescue mission." The base commander found himself making another command decision that would either save lives or end careers. "Ms. Thornton, you have authorization to launch. Godspeed." The laughter in the hangar died away as Becca began her pre-flight procedures. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, checking systems and preparing the aircraft for flight. The radio crackled with an update from the Northern Pride. Coast Guard, this is Northern Pride. We're down by the bow now. I can see water coming over the gunwale. I don't know how much longer we can stay afloat. Captain Chun keyed his radio. Northern Pride, this is Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak. We have a rescue helicopter launching in approximately 10 minutes. Hold on. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the sound of rotor blades filled Hangar 3. The old Huey's engine coughed to life, settling into the distinctive whop 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 that had been the soundtrack of 1,000 missions. Becca's voice came through the radio, calm and professional. Kodiak Base, this is Rescue 7, ready for departure. And with that, the rusty helicopter that everyone had dismissed as a relic began to move toward the hangar doors, carrying with it the hopes of 8 souls who were running out of time in the dark waters of the North Pacific. To anyone driving past the weathered mailbox marked R. Thornton on Rezanoff Drive, the small log cabin perched on the bluff overlooking Chiniak Bay looked like the modest home of a retired local. The structure itself was unremarkable cedar logs darkened by decades of coastal weather, a metal roof designed to shed Alaska's heavy snows, and a front porch cluttered with fishing gear, old coffee cans filled with bolts and screws, and a collection of worn-out work boots. The woman who lived there seemed to match the humble surroundings perfectly. Rebecca Thornton was a familiar sight around Kodiak, though most people knew her only in passing. She could be found every Tuesday morning at Safeway, pushing a shopping cart filled with practical items, canned goods, coffee, motor oil, and the occasional bag of peppermint candies she kept in her truck's glove compartment. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the uniform of rural Alaska, Carhartt work pants, flannel shirts, and steel-toed boots that had seen more miles than most people's cars. At the Harbor Master Cafe on Marine Way, Becca occupied the same corner booth every Friday morning at exactly 7 o'clock. She ordered black coffee and wheat toast, read the Kodiak Daily Mirror from front to back, and left a $5 tip on a $3 tab. The waitresses liked her because she was polite and undemanding, though she rarely engaged in the small talk that filled the restaurant during fishing season. When local fishermen complained about weather delays or equipment failures, she would nod sympathetically but offer little in the way of advice or commentary. The residents of Kodiak saw her at the post office, collecting mail from a box stuffed with aviation magazines and technical manuals that most people assumed were left over from a deceased husband's hobby. They encountered her at Petro Marine Supply, where she purchased maritime charts, weather instruments, and mechanical parts that the clerks couldn't identify. She paid in cash, spoke in measured sentences, and never lingered for the conversations that typically accompanied small-town commerce. At her pickup truck, a 1995 Ford F-150 with more rust than paint, was a constant presence around the island. She could be spotted driving the remote roads that led to the Coast Guard base, the airport, or the small communities scattered along the coastline. The truck's bed was always filled with an eclectic collection of equipment, toolboxes, fuel containers, survival gear, and mysterious metal components wrapped in canvas tarps. Local mechanics had learned that Becca Thornton could fix almost anything, from outboard motors to radio equipment, but she rarely volunteered her services unless specifically asked. Most people assumed she was a widow living on a modest pension, perhaps the survivor of a fisherman or Coast Guard member who had chosen to remain in Alaska after retirement. Her cabin showed signs of careful maintenance and frugal living, the kind of place where everything was repaired rather than replaced, where functionality mattered more than appearance. The small garden behind the house produced vegetables with military precision, planted in straight rows and tended with obvious expertise. What the community didn't see were the details that told a different story. The sophisticated radio antenna system mounted discreetly on the cabin's roof, capable of receiving aviation frequencies from across the North Pacific. The workshop in the basement, equipped with precision tools and testing equipment, that would have impressed professional aviation mechanics. The logbooks stacked on shelves in her study, filled with thousands of entries documenting flights to coordinates that few civilians would recognize. The books on her shelves revealed interests that extended far beyond the simple life she appeared to lead. Technical manuals on helicopter maintenance sat beside volumes on weather theory, navigation, and survival medicine. Aviation charts covered one wall of her study, marked with routes and notations in her precise handwriting. The charts showed flight paths to remote villages throughout Alaska, but also to locations that didn't appear on any tourist maps: military installations, oil exploration sites, and coordinates in the wilderness where few aircraft had ever landed. Her daily routine followed patterns that spoke of military discipline, though neighbors who occasionally glimpsed her morning activities simply assumed she was an early riser. She was awake before dawn every day, checking weather reports on multiple radio frequencies and reviewing maritime conditions throughout the Gulf of Alaska. Her morning walk along the bluff wasn't just exercise, it was a comprehensive assessment of wind patterns, visibility, and sea conditions that would influence flying decisions throughout the region. The small greenhouse attached to her cabin contained more than vegetables. Hidden among the tomato plants and herb gardens were weather monitoring instruments that provided data more accurate than anything available to commercial operators in the area. She maintained this equipment herself, calibrating sensors and recording observations with the attention to detail that professional meteorologists would have envied. Local businesses had learned that Becca Thornton was reliable in ways that went beyond simple customer loyalty. When the hardware store needed someone to deliver emergency supplies to remote work sites, they called her. When the medical clinic required transport for critical medications to outlying communities, her number was in their emergency contact list. She never advertised these services, never sought recognition for them, and always charged rates that barely covered her expenses. The post office clerks had noticed that she received mail from addresses across the country: veterans organizations, aviation associations, and government agencies that most Kodiak residents had never heard of. She collected packages containing technical publications, replacement parts for equipment that wasn't sold locally, and official documents that arrived in envelopes marked with federal return addresses. She signed for these deliveries without comment and never discussed their contents with anyone. Her banking habits were equally mysterious to those who had occasion to observe them. She maintained accounts at the local credit union, but conducted most of her business through wire transfers and electronic payments that suggested financial relationships extending far beyond Kodiak's simple economy. The bank manager had noticed that her account received regular deposits from sources he couldn't identify, and that she occasionally transferred substantial sums to accounts associated with veterans, organizations, and technical schools. At the Patia library, Becca was a regular presence in the reference section, researching topics that ranged from advances in aviation technology to changes in federal regulations governing civilian aircraft operations. She used the internet terminals to access websites that most patrons ignored: military databases, technical forums, and official publications from agencies like the Federal Aviation Administration and National Transportation Safety Board. The librarians appreciated her quiet demeanor and the fact that she always cleaned up her work area before leaving. Her social interactions were limited but meaningful. She attended the monthly meetings of the Kodiak Veterans Association, though she rarely spoke during the formal sessions. Afterward, she could often be found in quiet conversation with other members, discussing topics that outsiders couldn't quite overhear. These conversations had the tone of technical consultations, with references to equipment, procedures, and experiences that suggested shared professional backgrounds. The local airport staff knew her as a frequent visitor to the maintenance hangars, where she observed work being performed on various aircraft with the intensity of someone conducting a professional inspection. She never interfered with ongoing operations, but mechanics had learned that her quiet suggestions about technical problems were usually worth considering. She spoke their language, the precise terminology of aviation professionals who had spent decades working with complex mechanical systems. Her medical records, maintained at the island's health clinic, revealed a pattern of injuries consistent with a physically demanding career. Old fractures in her wrists and ankles, scars from burns and cuts, and joint problems that suggested years of operating heavy machinery in challenging conditions. The clinic's physician had noted her exceptional physical conditioning for someone her age, and her detailed knowledge of emergency medical procedures that went far beyond basic first aid training. The clothing in her closet told its own story to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Flight suits that had been carefully maintained despite their age, boots designed for use in aircraft, and jackets with faded patches that had been removed, but left telltale outlines in the fabric. Her dresser drawers contained equipment that most civilians would never need: high-altitude watches, survival tools, and communication devices that operated on frequencies restricted to military and emergency services. Even her choice of vehicle suggested purposes beyond simple transportation. The Ford pickup had been modified with additional fuel capacity, enhanced electrical systems, and mounting points for equipment that wasn't currently installed. The truck's maintenance records showed upgrades and repairs that indicated regular use in demanding conditions, with attention to reliability that suggested its owner's life might depend on its performance. Her personal habits reflected disciplines learned in environments where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. She maintained emergency supplies in multiple locations, checked equipment on regular schedules, and prepared for contingencies that most people never considered. Her freezer contained enough food for several weeks. Her generator was tested monthly, and her communication equipment was inspected with the thoroughness of someone who understood that isolation could be deadly. The neighbors who waved to her during their occasional encounters saw only a polite, self-sufficient woman who kept to herself and caused no trouble. They had no reason to suspect that the quiet resident of the modest cabin was anything other than what she appeared to be: another retiree who had chosen Alaska's rugged beauty over the conveniences of urban life. The complex reality of Rebecca Thornton's background remained hidden beneath layers of deliberate anonymity, waiting for circumstances that would reveal the extraordinary capabilities concealed within an ordinary appearance. To the community of Kodiak, she was simply Becca, a reliable neighbor, a competent handywoman, and a woman who minded her own business while quietly contributing to the fabric of island life. What the residents of Kodiak didn't know was that Becca Thornton had once been Chief Warrant Officer for Rebecca Martinez, one of the most decorated helicopter pilots in the history of the United States Army. Her military personnel file, sealed in a vault at the Pentagon, contained commendations and mission reports that read like fiction to anyone unfamiliar with the realities of combat aviation. Her journey had begun 38 years earlier in a small town outside San Antonio, Texas, where Rebecca Martinez had grown up as the daughter of a mechanic who worked on crop dusters and charter aircraft. At age 17, she had enlisted in the Army with dreams of learning to fly, but the military had different plans. In 1983, women weren't permitted to serve in combat roles, so she was assigned to the Transportation Corps as a helicopter mechanic, working on UH-1 Hueys at Fort Rucker, Alabama. The restriction on women in combat didn't prevent her from learning everything possible about the aircraft she maintained. During off-duty hours, she studied flight manuals, practiced on simulators, and absorbed knowledge from every pilot willing to share their expertise. Her mechanical background gave her an understanding of helicopter systems that many pilots lacked, and her natural aptitude for three-dimensional thinking made flying seem as natural as walking. When the Army finally opened helicopter pilot training to women in 1993, Rebecca was among the first to apply. At age 28, she was older than most flight school candidates, But her decade of experience as a mechanic gave her advantages that quickly became apparent. She graduated first in her class from the initial entry rotary wing course, earning her wings and assignment to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers. The 160th SOAR was the Army's most elite helicopter unit, tasked with inserting and extracting special operations forces in the world's most dangerous locations. Their motto, "Night Stalkers Don't Quit," wasn't just a slogan. It was a promise written in blood across decades of missions that others deemed impossible. Rebecca's assignment to the unit was both an honor and a sentence to years of operations that would never appear in newspapers or history books. Her first deployment took her to Somalia in 1994, where she flew missions supporting Task Force Ranger operations in Mogadishu. While the public knew about the events of October 3rd that inspired the movie Black Hawk Down, they never learned about the dozens of other missions that Rebecca and her fellow Night Stalkers flew in the urban warfare environment of the Somali capital. She piloted UH-60 Black Hawks through narrow city streets, landed in courtyards barely larger than tennis courts, and extracted wounded soldiers while bullets shattered her windscreen. The Somalia deployment earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross for a mission that remained classified decades later. According to the citation, Chief Warrant Officer Martinez had flown her heavily damaged aircraft through intense enemy fire to extract a special operations team that was surrounded and facing annihilation. Despite losing hydraulic power and flying with manual controls, she had maintained her position while the team climbed aboard, then flown the damaged helicopter 15 miles to safety before making an emergency landing that saved 7 lives. Her next assignment took her to the Balkans, where NATO forces were attempting to maintain peace in the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars. Flying missions over Bosnia and Kosovo, Rebecca learned to navigate the complex political and ethnic tensions that made every flight a potential international incident. She transported humanitarian supplies to isolated villages, evacuated wounded civilians from areas too dangerous for ground vehicles, and conducted reconnaissance missions that helped prevent massacres. The Balkan deployment introduced her to a different kind of flying missions, where success was measured not in enemy casualties, but in lives saved and conflicts prevented. She developed expertise in medical evacuation procedures, becoming qualified as a flight medic in addition to her pilot duties. Her aircraft became a mobile emergency room, equipped with life support equipment and staffed with medical personnel who could provide critical care during flight. When the September 11th attacks launched the global war on terror, Rebecca was among the first pilots deployed to Afghanistan. Operating from forward bases in the Hindu Kush Mountains, she flew missions that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible with rotary wing aircraft. The thin air at high altitude reduced helicopter performance, while the mountainous terrain created wind patterns that could slam aircraft into mountainsides without warning. Her logbooks from the Afghanistan deployment recorded over 1,200 combat flight hours in conditions that would have grounded civilian aircraft. She flew night missions using night vision goggles, navigating by landmarks invisible to pilots who lacked her experience. She conducted air assaults into landing zones that existed only as GPS coordinates, trusting her skills and her aircraft to find safe ground in terrain that maps described simply as mountainous. The mission that defined her career occurred during the winter of 2003, when a special forces team was trapped by an avalanche in a remote valley near the Pakistani border. The team's radio operator had been injured, their emergency beacon was malfunctioning, and weather conditions had prevented all rescue attempts for 72 hours. Intelligence indicated that Taliban forces were converging on the area, turning the rescue into a race against time. Rebecca volunteered for a mission that other pilots had deemed impossible, flying a modified UH-60 equipped with extended range fuel tanks, She penetrated deep into enemy territory during a blizzard that reduced visibility to mere yards. Using nothing but terrain features and dead reckoning navigation, she located the trapped team in conditions that prevented the use of electronic navigation aids. The landing zone was a narrow ledge on a mountainside, barely wide enough for her. Helicopter skids, with rotors spinning just feet from rock walls and the aircraft balanced on the edge of a 1,000-foot drop. She held position while the team climbed aboard. The extraction required 3 separate trips due to weight limitations in the thin mountain air, each flight taking her deeper into enemy territory as Taliban forces closed in. On the final extraction, her helicopter took hits from small arms, fire that damaged her tail rotor and punctured her fuel tank. Flying with degraded controls and fuel streaming from her aircraft, she managed to reach friendly territory before making an emergency landing that saved the lives of 12 special operations personnel. The mission earned her a 2nd Distinguished Flying Cross and a Silver Star, decorations that remained classified for over a decade. Her expertise in high-altitude operations led to assignment as an instructor pilot at the Army's Mountain Warfare School, where she trained other aviators in the specialized techniques required for flying in extreme terrain. She developed training protocols that became standard throughout the Army, teaching pilots how to read mountain weather, navigate in GPS-denied environments, and execute precision landings in impossible conditions. The Iraq War brought different challenges but equally demanding missions. Operating from bases throughout the country, Rebecca flew everything from routine supply runs to complex special operations missions that took her deep into insurgent-controlled territory. She became expert in urban warfare flying, threading her helicopter between buildings and power lines, while avoiding the rocket-propelled grenades and small arms fire that made every flight a combat mission. Her final deployment took her to Syria in 2016, where she flew classified missions supporting Special Operations Forces fighting ISIS. The enemy had learned to use commercial drones as weapons, creating new threats that required constant adaptation of tactics and equipment. Rebecca helped develop countermeasures against drone attacks while continuing to fly missions that pushed her aircraft and crew to their limits. After 28 years of military service, Chief Warrant Officer 4 Rebecca Martinez had accumulated over 4,800 flight hours in combat zones, making her one of the most experienced combat pilots in Army history. Her personnel file contained 14 major decorations for valor, including 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, a Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with V-Device for valor, and 4 Air Medals with V-Device. She had been shot down twice, crash-landed 4 times, and survived more close calls than she cared to remember. But the years of combat flying had taken their toll. The constant stress of flying in hostile environments, the weight of responsibility for her crews and passengers, and the accumulated effects of numerous injuries had left her physically and emotionally exhausted. When the Army offered her a promotion to major and assignment to a staff position at the Pentagon, she declined and submitted her retirement papers instead. The decision to leave the military wasn't driven by any single event, but by the gradual realization that she had given everything she could to the service. She had flown missions that younger pilots would study for decades, saved lives in circumstances that would become legends, and helped train the next generation of Army aviators. At age 51, she was ready for a different kind of life. Her choice to settle in Alaska was influenced by memories of training exercises conducted in the state's challenging environment. During her career, she had flown missions in Alaska's wilderness that reminded her why she had fallen in love with aviation in the first place. The combination of technical challenge and natural beauty offered a chance to continue flying without the weight of military responsibility. The transition to civilian life proved more difficult than expected. The Federal Aviation Administration recognized her military flight hours, but converting her military qualifications to civilian ratings required extensive testing and bureaucratic procedures that seemed designed to discourage military pilots. The cost of maintaining commercial pilot certification, combined with the limited opportunities for helicopter pilots in Alaska's civilian market, forced her to reconsider her plans. She used her military retirement benefits and savings to purchase the surplus UH-1H helicopter that would become her primary aircraft for the next 2 decades. The Huey was similar to the aircraft she had maintained as a young mechanic, creating a connection to the early days of her career when flying had been a dream rather than a demanding profession. The helicopter required extensive maintenance and modification to meet civilian standards, work that she performed herself using skills learned during her years as a mechanic. Her marriage to Staff Sergeant Michael Thornton, a fellow veteran she had met during her final assignment, provided the emotional stability she needed to successfully transition to civilian life. Michael understood the challenges of leaving military service and supported her decision to pursue civilian flying on her own terms. When he was killed in a motorcycle accident just 3 years after her retirement, she chose to keep his name as a way of honoring their brief but meaningful marriage. The decades that followed were spent building a civilian flying career that utilized her military skills while serving Alaska's remote communities. She flew medical evacuation missions to villages accessible only by aircraft, delivered supplies to research stations and remote installations, and provided transportation for emergency responders operating in areas where ground vehicles couldn't reach. The work was demanding but rewarding, allowing her to use her expertise in service of others without the constant threat of enemy action. Her decision to maintain a low profile wasn't driven by modesty but by necessity. Military pilots transitioning to civilian careers often faced skepticism from employers who questioned whether combat skills translated to civilian operations. Rather than fight these perceptions, she chose to demonstrate her capabilities through actions, building a reputation for reliability and competence that spoke louder than any military decoration. The financial realities of civilian aviation eventually forced her to ground her beloved Huey, but she never regretted the years spent flying in Alaska's wilderness. The missions she flew as a civilian pilot lacked the intensity of military operations, but they provided something equally valuable: the opportunity to use her skills in service of her community without the political complexities that had surrounded her military career. Now, standing in Coast Guard Hangar 3 with 8 lives hanging in the balance, Chief Warrant Officer 4 Rebecca Martinez was about to emerge from behind the quiet facade of Becca Thornton, bringing 3 decades of combat experience to bear on a mission that would remind everyone why the Night Stalkers never quit. The first radio transmission from the fishing vessel Northern Pride had reached Coast Guard communications at 2:43 a.m. when Captain Mike Torino's voice crackled through the static of deteriorating atmospheric conditions. Coast Guard Station Kodiak, this is fishing vessel Northern Pride. Registration number Alaska 4-7-9-2-Charlie. We are approximately 47 nautical miles northwest of Shuyak Island, and we have struck an underwater obstruction. We are taking on water and require immediate assistance. The duty officer at the Rescue Coordination Center had responded with practiced efficiency, dispatching a 47-foot motor lifeboat from Station Kodiak while simultaneously alerting the air station for possible helicopter support. Under normal circumstances, the Northern Pride's position would have presented a routine rescue scenario, challenging but well within the capabilities of Coast Guard assets designed specifically for such emergencies. But these were not normal circumstances. The underwater obstruction that had torn open the Northern Pride's hull was a massive Douglas fir log, waterlogged and floating just beneath the surface where sonar couldn't detect it. The tree had been washed into the ocean during spring floods 3 months earlier, its journey from the forests of mainland Alaska ending in a collision that would threaten 8 lives. The impact had occurred at 2:15 a.m. when the Northern Pride was returning from a successful halibut fishing expedition in the deep waters beyond the continental shelf. Captain Torino had been running at reduced speed due to fog, but the vessel's forward momentum had driven the log through the fiberglass hull like a battering ram. The breach was located below the waterline in the forward compartment, where the curved shape of the hull made temporary repairs nearly impossible. Aboard the Northern Pride, the situation had deteriorated rapidly from the moment of impact. The initial assessment revealed a hole approximately 3 feet long and 18 inches wide, allowing thousands of gallons of frigid seawater to pour into the vessel every minute. The manual bilge pumps designed to handle normal seepage and minor leaks were overwhelmed within minutes of the collision. Captain Torino was a 20-year veteran of Alaska's commercial fishing industry, experienced in dealing with mechanical failures, severe weather, and the countless emergencies that arose when working in one of the world's most dangerous occupations. He had weathered storms that had sunk other vessels, navigated through ice fields that would have crushed less sturdy boats, and brought his crew home safely from situations that had defeated more experienced captains. But this emergency was different. The Northern Pride was taking on water faster than any pumping system could remove it, and the vessel's increasing list was making it impossible to maintain proper trim. The boat was designed to handle the rolling motion of ocean swells, but the asymmetric flooding was creating a stability problem that could result in catastrophic capsizing if the water level continued to rise. The crew consisted of 4 experienced fishermen who had worked with Captain Torino for multiple seasons. Jimmy Kowalski, the boat's engineer, was a former Navy machinist who understood marine systems better than most shipyard technicians. Tony Delacruz had spent 15 years working the Alaskan waters and could handle any fishing equipment ever manufactured. Sam Chun was the youngest crew member, but had already proven himself during 2 years of dangerous winter fishing. Pete Morrison was the boat's cook and medic, trained in emergency medical procedures and equipped to handle the injuries that were common in commercial fishing. The presence of Captain Torino's family aboard the vessel added emotional complexity to an already dangerous situation. His wife Maria had accompanied him on this trip to celebrate their 15th wedding anniversary, bringing their 2 children for what was supposed to be a safe offshore adventure. 7-year-old Sofia and 9-year-old Carlos had been excited about their first real fishing expedition, unaware that the ocean could transform from playground to executioner in a matter of minutes. As water continued to flood the forward compartment, the Northern Pride's bow began to settle lower in the water. The vessel's center of gravity shifted forward, creating a nose-down attitude that increased the rate of flooding. Captain Torino tried adjusting the vessel's trim by moving fuel and water between tanks, but the modifications weren't sufficient to compensate for the massive amount of seawater entering through the hull breach. The Coast Guard motor lifeboat, dispatched from station Kodiak, was making best possible speed toward the Northern Pride's position, but the vessel's location placed it at the extreme range of the smaller boat's operational capabilities. The motor lifeboat was designed for nearshore rescues and could handle moderate sea conditions, but the deteriorating weather was creating waves that challenged even experienced Coast Guard coxswains. Weather conditions throughout the Gulf of Alaska were rapidly becoming critical for maritime operations. A low-pressure system moving in from the central Pacific was generating winds that had increased from 15 knots to 25 knots in just 2 hours, with gusts reaching 35 knots. The wave height had grown from 4 feet to 8 feet, with individual swells reaching 12 feet as the storm intensified. Visibility was dropping as fog banks rolled in from the deeper ocean waters. What had started as clear conditions with unlimited visibility had deteriorated to less than half a mile, making visual navigation increasingly difficult. The combination of increasing winds, growing seas, and reduced visibility created a maritime environment that challenged even the most experienced mariners. Temperature conditions added another layer of danger to the developing emergency. The air temperature had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, while the water temperature measured a bone-chilling 42 degrees. These conditions meant that anyone entering the water would have less than 30 minutes of useful consciousness, and perhaps an hour before hypothermia became fatal. The Northern Pride's crew and passengers were wearing standard fishing gear, not survival suits designed for cold water immersion. At Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak, the mechanical failure of both primary rescue helicopters had created an unprecedented situation. The HH-6 Jayhawk helicopters were specifically designed for maritime rescue operations, equipped with sophisticated navigation systems, weather radar, and rescue equipment that made them ideally suited for missions like the Northern Pride emergency. The aircraft featured advanced autopilot systems that could maintain precise hovering positions during rescue operations, allowing crews to focus on extracting survivors rather than flying the aircraft. The backup systems that normally provided redundancy for Coast Guard operations had also failed. The nearest Coast Guard air assets were stationed in Sitka, over 300 miles southeast of Kodiak. Even if those aircraft launched immediately, they would require more than 2 hours to reach the Northern Pride's position, far too long for a vessel that was flooding rapidly in deteriorating sea conditions. Navy and Air Force assets in Alaska were committed to other operations or lacked the specialized equipment required for maritime rescue missions. The Alaska Air National Guard operated search and rescue helicopters, but their aircraft were positioned in Anchorage, even farther from the emergency scene than the Coast Guard. Helicopters in Sitka, military doctrine required specific authorization procedures for civilian rescue missions, adding bureaucratic delays that could prove fatal in time-critical situations. Commercial helicopter operators throughout Alaska monitored Coast Guard radio frequencies, but none possessed aircraft capable of conducting offshore rescue operations in the deteriorating weather conditions most civilian helicopters lacked the range to reach the Northern Pride's position, and those with sufficient fuel capacity weren't equipped with rescue hoists or medical equipment necessary for maritime emergencies. The Northern Pride's position, approximately 47 miles northwest of Shuyak Island, placed the vessel in one of the most challenging rescue environments in Alaska waters. The area was characterized by complex underwater topography that created unpredictable current patterns and wave interactions. Submerged rocks and changing depths made the region dangerous for surface vessels, while variable wind patterns created turbulence that complicated helicopter operations. As the emergency progressed, Captain Torino continued providing position updates and status reports to Coast Guard communicators. His voice remained calm and professional, but experienced rescue coordinators could detect the underlying stress that indicated a captain facing the possible loss of his vessel and crew. Each transmission included increasingly urgent details about the vessel's condition and the deteriorating situation aboard. Coast Guard, this is Northern Pride. Water level in the forward compartment is now above the deck plates. We've lost our forward bilge pump to flooding. The boat is listing approximately 10 degrees to port and down by the bow. We're continuing manual pumping operations, but we're not keeping up with the flooding rate. The mathematics of the situation were becoming increasingly grim. Coast Guard analysts calculated that the Northern Pride was taking out approximately 800 gallons of water per minute, while the crew's manual pumping efforts could remove perhaps 200 gallons per minute under optimal conditions. The vessel's reserve buoyancy was being consumed at a rate that would result in sinking within 2 to 3 hours unless the flooding could be controlled or the crew evacuated. Radio transmissions from the Northern Pride included background sounds that painted a vivid picture of the desperate situation aboard the vessel. The constant noise of manual pumps operating at maximum capacity mixed with the sounds of water sloshing in the flooded compartments Periodic impacts as waves struck the vessel's hull created jarring interruptions in communications, while the increasing engine noise indicated that Captain Torino was using maximum power to maintain the vessel's position against wind and current. Presence of children aboard the Northern Pride added emotional urgency to what was already a critical situation. Coast Guard rescue coordinators understood that civilian passengers, particularly children, were more vulnerable to panic and hypothermia than experienced fishermen. A psychological impact of watching their family boat slowly sink could traumatize the children even if they survived the physical aspects of the emergency. Weather forecasts indicated that conditions would continue deteriorating throughout the morning hours, with winds increasing to 35 knots sustained and gusts to 50 knots by midday. Wave heights were predicted to reach 12 to 15 feet, with occasional swells to 20 feet in areas where currents and underwater topography amplified the storm's effects. These conditions would make rescue operations increasingly dangerous. For both survivors and rescuers, the Coast Guard's motor lifeboat crew reported their own challenges as they fought through increasingly rough seas toward the Northern Pride's position. The smaller vessel was taking a beating from waves that were approaching the limits of safe operation, and the crew estimated their arrival time at nearly 4 hours due to the need to reduce speed for safety. By the time the motor lifeboat could reach the fishing vessel, the Northern Pride would likely have already sunk. In the Coast Guard's Rescue Coordination Center, emergency coordinators were running out of options. Standard rescue protocols called for immediate helicopter response to maritime emergencies occurring beyond the range of surface vessels, but the mechanical failures had eliminated that capability. The situation was evolving into exactly the kind of emergency that had led to the establishment of Coast Guard aviation, lives threatened by circumstances that surface vessels couldn't address quickly enough. As dawn approached on what had started as a routine fishing trip, 8 people aboard the Northern Pride faced the very real possibility that they would not see another sunset. The vessel that had been their source of livelihood and family adventure was slowly becoming their tomb, settling deeper into the frigid waters of the North Pacific. While help remained hours away from reaching them, the emergency had evolved from a mechanical problem to a race against time, physics, and the unforgiving realities of maritime operations in one of the world's most dangerous marine environments. The emergency briefing in Coast Guard Operations Center had reached its most critical point when Captain Chun finally voiced what everyone in the room was thinking, but no one wanted to say aloud. "We don't have any viable rescue assets that can reach the Northern Pride in time. Our helicopters are down, the motor lifeboat won't arrive for 4 hours, and every other agency is either too far away or doesn't have the capability." Lieutenant Commander Morrison stood at the situation board, marking the vessel's last known position with growing frustration. As the senior pilot on duty, he felt the weight of 8 lives pressing down on his shoulders, while his aircraft sat useless in the hangar with transmission problems that would take a full maintenance crew 12 hours to repair. "Sir, there has to be something we can do. We can't just watch that family die because our equipment failed." Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez had been thinking about the old helicopter in Hangar 3 since the emergency began, but mentioning civilian aircraft seemed almost disrespectful to the professional capabilities that the Coast Guard normally brought to rescue operations. Finally, with time running out and options exhausted, he cleared his throat and spoke up. "Captain, I know this sounds crazy, but there's that old Huey that belongs to the local woman. The one that's been sitting in our hangar for maintenance." The suggestion drew immediate skepticism from everyone in the operations center. Master Chief Thompson, who had overseen thousands of rescue missions during his 28-year career, shook his head dismissively. "Chief, that aircraft hasn't flown in 8 months, and even when it was operational, it was barely airworthy for civilian charter flights. This is a life-or-death maritime rescue in deteriorating weather conditions. We need a real rescue helicopter." Not some surplus military aircraft held together with duct tape and wishful thinking. Lieutenant Commander Morrison examined the weather data streaming across multiple computer screens, showing wind speeds increasing by the hour and visibility dropping as fog banks moved in from the ocean. Besides, who would fly it? None of our pilots have experience with aircraft that old. The Huey uses completely different systems than our Jayhawks. Manual flight controls, analog instruments, hydraulic systems from the 1970s. It would be like asking a Formula One driver to race a Model T Ford. Captain Chun was studying the Maritime Rescue Manual, searching for any regulation or procedure that might provide another option. Coast Guard doctrine emphasized using appropriate equipment operated by qualified personnel, not desperate improvisation with unsuitable assets. Gentlemen, I appreciate creative thinking, but we have legal and safety responsibilities that prevent us from launching unqualified aircraft on rescue missions. The liability alone would end all our careers. The radio crackled with another transmission. From the Northern Pride, Captain Torino's voice carrying new urgency as he reported their deteriorating condition. Coast Guard, this is Northern Pride. The water is now coming over our main deck. We've lost power to our pumps. I've got my family in survival suits, but I don't know how much longer we can keep this boat afloat. Please advise on rescue status. The desperation in the fishing captain's voice cut through the operations center like a knife. Every person in the room understood that they were listening to a man who might be making his final radio transmission, and their inability to respond with immediate assistance felt like a failure of everything the Coast Guard represented. Rodriguez found himself thinking about conversations he had overheard in local establishments, fragments of stories about the woman who owned the old helicopter. Sir, maybe we should at least talk to the owner. I know she does medical evacuations and supply runs to remote villages. She might have ideas about alternatives we haven't considered. The suggestion seemed reasonable as an information-gathering exercise, even if it didn't lead to actionable solutions. Captain Chun nodded to his communications specialist. Get me Rebecca Thornton on the phone. We'll at least explore every option before we have to tell that family there's nothing we can do. When the call connected and Captain Chun explained the situation, Rebecca's immediate response surprised everyone in the operations center. Her voice carried none of the uncertainty or hesitation they expected from a civilian discussing a complex military rescue operation. Captain, I've been monitoring the radio traffic since this started. The Northern Pride is in serious trouble, and you're right that surface assets won't reach them in time. Miss Thornton, we're exploring all possible options. Can you tell us about the condition of your aircraft and whether you think it might be useful in this situation? Rebecca's response came without any pause for consideration, as if she had already analyzed every aspect of the emergency and reached her own conclusions. The helicopter is mechanically sound. The engine has approximately 400 hours since its last major overhaul. The flight controls have been recently inspected, and all required maintenance is current. The aircraft lacks modern navigation equipment, but it has sufficient range to reach the Northern Pride's position and return with a full load of passengers. The matter-of-fact tone of her assessment caught the Coast Guard officers off guard. Most civilians discussing aircraft capabilities would include uncertainty, disclaimers, or requests for technical consultation. Rebecca spoke with the precision of someone providing a professional evaluation of operational readiness. Lieutenant Commander Morrison leaned toward the speakerphone. Ma'am, with all due respect, maritime rescue operations require specialized equipment and training. We're talking about precision hovering in high winds, conducting rescues from a vessel that may be partially submerged, and flying in visibility conditions that challenge even experienced pilots. I understand the mission requirements, Commander. The question is whether you're willing to authorize the use of available assets when your primary equipment is unavailable. Captain Chun found himself in an impossible position. Military regulations and common sense argued against authorizing a civilian aircraft for a rescue mission that would challenge even Coast Guard helicopters. But the alternative was accepting that 8 people would die because bureaucratic procedures prevented the use of potentially viable resources. Miss Thornton, assuming we could authorize your aircraft for this mission, who would pilot it? Our crew are trained on completely different systems. Rebecca's answer came with the same calm certainty that had characterized her entire conversation. I can fly it. The silence in the operations center stretched for several seconds as everyone processed what they had just heard. The idea of a 64-year-old civilian woman conducting a maritime rescue mission in deteriorating weather conditions seemed so improbable that no one immediately knew how to respond. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was the first to break the silence, and his response carried barely contained disbelief. Ma'am, I appreciate your willingness to help, but this is a complex rescue operation in challenging conditions. We're not talking about a sightseeing flight or a routine transport mission. Master Chief Thompson couldn't suppress a short laugh at the absurdity of the suggestion. Lady, no offense, but we're dealing with a life-or-death emergency here. 8 people are about to die in some of the most dangerous waters in Alaska. This isn't the time for civilian volunteers to play hero. The dismissive tone in Thompson's voice seemed to trigger something in Rebecca, though her response remained professionally controlled. Chief, I understand your concerns about civilian capabilities. Perhaps you should consider whether your assumptions about those capabilities are based on complete information. Rodriguez sensed something in Rebecca's tone that the others had missed, a suggestion that there was more to her background than anyone realized. Ma'am, could you tell us about your flying experience? Just so we understand what we're dealing with. I have approximately 5,000 flight hours in rotary wing aircraft, including extensive experience in emergency medical evacuation and operations in adverse weather conditions. I'm familiar with maritime rescue procedures and have conducted similar missions in challenging environments. The numbers Rebecca quoted were impressive enough to give the Coast Guard officers pause. 5,000 hours represented more flight time than many professional pilots accumulated in entire careers, and her mention of emergency medical evacuation suggested experience with precisely the kind of mission they were facing. But Lieutenant Commander Morrison remained skeptical of claims that seemed too convenient to be credible. Ma'am, that's certainly extensive experience for a civilian pilot. Where did you acquire that training and experience? Rebecca's pause before answering lasted just long enough to suggest that she was choosing her words carefully. I spent 28 years in military service before retiring to Alaska. My experience includes operations in various theaters where helicopter rescue was a primary mission. The revelation that Rebecca was a military veteran changed the dynamic in the operations center immediately. Veterans understood that military flying, particularly in combat zones, provided experience that civilian training could never match. But questions remained about the specifics of her background and whether her experience was relevant to the current emergency. Captain Chen found himself reconsidering assumptions he had made about the civilian helicopter owner. Military pilots, especially those with extensive combat experience, possessed skills that often exceeded those of civilian operators. Miss Thornton, what aircraft did you fly during your military service? Primarily UH-60 Black Hawks with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Some UH-1 Hueys early in my career. I also have experience with various other rotary wing platforms. The mention of the 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers, sent a shock through everyone in the operations center who understood military aviation. The 160th was legendary among military pilots, known for missions that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible with helicopter operations. Night Stalker pilots were among the most skilled and experienced aviators in any military service, But Morrison remained cautious about accepting claims that seemed almost too perfect for their current situation. "Ma'am, the 160th SOAR is an elite unit. If you served with them, you'd have extensive experience with exactly these kinds of missions. Commander, I wouldn't have volunteered if I didn't believe I could complete the mission successfully." The confidence in Rebecca's voice was convincing, but Captain Chun still faced the responsibility of authorizing a civilian aircraft for a rescue mission that violated numerous regulations and procedures. "Miss Thornton, even if we accept that you have the necessary experience, your aircraft is a 50-year-old helicopter that's been grounded for 8 months. How can we be certain it's safe for this kind of operation?" "Captain, I maintained that aircraft personally throughout my civilian career. I know every component, every system, and every limitation. The helicopter may be old, but it's mechanically sound and appropriate for the mission requirements." Rodriguez looked at the weather displays showing conditions continuing to deteriorate. Around the Northern Pride's position. "Ma'am, can you be here quickly? We're running out of time." "I'm already driving to the base. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The fact that Rebecca was already en route suggested that she had been preparing for this possibility since the emergency began, monitoring Coast Guard communications and making her own assessment of the situation. This level of situational awareness impressed the Coast Guard officers, who recognized it as evidence of professional competence rather than civilian enthusiasm. As the call ended, Captain Chun faced a decision that would define his career and potentially determine whether 8 people lived or died. Every regulation and procedure argued against authorizing a civilian aircraft for a rescue mission, but the alternative was accepting failure when a potentially viable option existed. Lieutenant Commander Morrison summed up the dilemma facing everyone in the operations center. "Sir, if we authorize this and something goes wrong, we'll all be held responsible for using inappropriate resources. But if we don't authorize it and those people die, we'll have to live with knowing we had an option and chose not to use it." The radio crackled again with Captain Torino's voice, now carrying an edge of panic that hadn't been present in earlier transmissions. "Coast Guard, this is Northern Pride. The boat is going down by the bow. We're abandoning ship and deploying. Life rafts, please hurry." In that moment, Captain Chun's decision became clear. Regulations and procedures were important, but they existed to serve the Coast Guard's primary mission of saving lives at sea. When following those procedures would result in preventable deaths, a commander's duty was to find alternatives. "Miss Thornton has authorization to use her aircraft for this rescue mission," he announced to the operations center. "When she arrives, we'll provide her with all necessary support and coordination." The authorization represented a leap of faith, based on incomplete information and military credentials that no one had verified. But with 8 lives hanging in the balance and no other options available, faith was sometimes the most rational choice available to commanders facing impossible decisions. When Rebecca, Thornton's weathered Ford pickup truck, pulled up to the Coast Guard hangar, the assembled personnel were expecting to see a determined but ultimately naive civilian who would quickly realize that good intentions couldn't substitute for proper equipment and training. What they encountered instead was a woman who moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had responded to countless emergencies and understood exactly what needed to be accomplished. She stepped out of the truck wearing a flight suit that looked military in cut and functionality, though the patches and insignia had been removed years earlier. Her movements were economical and deliberate as she retrieved a flight helmet and kit bag from the passenger seat, checking each item with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on proper equipment management. Lieutenant Commander Morrison watched her approach the hangar and felt his skepticism deepen. The woman walking toward them looked like someone's grandmother heading to a community theater rehearsal, not a pilot preparing for a dangerous rescue mission in deteriorating weather conditions. "This is insane," he muttered to Master Chief Thompson. We're about to send a senior citizen and a museum piece to attempt a rescue. That would challenge our best equipment and crews." Master Chief Thompson nodded in agreement, his expression reflecting 3 decades of experience with military aviation and the harsh realities of maritime rescue operations. "Sir, I've seen a lot of good people die because someone made a decision based on desperation instead of sound judgment. This feels like one of those decisions." But Chief Rodriguez found himself watching Rebecca's movements with growing interest. Something about her approach to the aircraft suggested familiarity that went beyond casual ownership. She wasn't walking toward the helicopter like someone hoping it would work. She was moving like someone who knew it would work because she had made it work countless times before. Rebecca approached the UH-1H Huey with the systematic methodology of a pilot conducting a thorough pre-flight inspection. She began at the tail rotor, examining the blade attachment points and checking for any signs of damage or wear that might have developed during the 8 months of storage. Her hands moved across the components with muscle memory, finding inspection points and checking connections with the confidence of someone who could perform the examination blindfolded. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Commander Morrison called out, "we need to discuss the mission parameters and coordination procedures before you begin any aircraft preparation." Rebecca didn't pause in her inspection or look up from the tail rotor hub she was examining. "Commander, I'm conducting my pre-flight inspection. We can discuss coordination while I work, but I won't delay aircraft preparation for conversations we could have had while I was driving here." The matter-of-fact dismissal of his attempt to control the situation caught Morrison off guard. Military pilots were accustomed to detailed briefings and coordination meetings before any mission, particularly rescue operations involving multiple agencies. Rebecca's apparent indifference to standard procedures reinforced his doubts about her professionalism. She moved forward along the aircraft's fuselage, checking access panels and inspection ports with practiced efficiency. At each point, her examination followed a specific sequence that suggested extensive training rather than casual familiarity. She opened the engine compartment and peered inside, her hands checking oil levels, examining hose connections, and verifying that all required components were properly secured. Chief Rodriguez found himself recognizing the inspection routine Rebecca was following. "Sir," he said quietly to Morrison, "she's following standard military pre-flight procedures. That's not something you learn from civilian training." Rebecca continued her external inspection, moving to the main rotor head and examining each blade attachment point with careful attention to detail. She was looking for specific types of damage and wear patterns that indicated potential mechanical problems, checking items that civilian pilots often overlooked because they lacked the technical knowledge to understand their significance. As she worked, she began speaking aloud, calling out her findings in a professional tone that surprised the Coast Guard observers. Tail rotor blades secure, no visible damage or excessive wear. Engine oil level normal, no leaks detected. Main rotor head bolts torqued to specification, no visible cracks or corrosion. Flight controls appear secure and undamaged. The terminology she was using caught Master Chief Thompson's attention. Her language was precise and technical, using specific aviation terms that suggested extensive training in helicopter maintenance and operation. Civilian pilots typically used less precise language when discussing aircraft systems, lacking the detailed knowledge that came from military training. Rebecca opened the pilot's door and climbed into the left seat, her movements fluid and comfortable. In the confined cockpit space, she adjusted the seat and controls with automatic motions, positioning herself for optimal reach and visibility without the hesitation that would have indicated unfamiliarity with the aircraft layout. "Battery master switch on," she announced, beginning the engine start checklist with professional precision. "Fuel pumps on, mixture rich, engine oil pressure indicating normal, flight instruments coming alive." Her hands moved across the control panel with confidence, activating systems and checking readings with the smooth efficiency of someone who had performed these procedures thousands of times. Each switch and control was positioned correctly without fumbling or uncertainty, suggesting intimate familiarity with the aircraft systems. Lieutenant Commander Morrison climbed into the co-pilot seat, hoping to observe her procedures and assess her actual competence. What he found disturbed his preconceptions about civilian aviation capabilities. The woman beside him was operating the aircraft with precision that matched or exceeded what he would have expected from experienced military pilots. "Ma'am, I have to ask about your instrument flying capabilities. The weather is deteriorating rapidly, and we may encounter instrument conditions during this mission." Rebecca's response came without any pause in her pre-flight procedures. "Commander, I'm instrument-rated in rotary wing aircraft with extensive experience in adverse weather operations. Weather conditions for this mission are well within my operational limits." She continued her checklist, calling out each item and verification in the crisp, professional tone that military aviators use during critical phases of flight operations. Engine oil temperature and pressure normal. Transmission oil pressure normal. Fuel quantity sufficient for mission plus reserves. Radio communications check complete. The radio equipment in the Huey was basic compared to modern Coast Guard helicopters, but Rebecca operated it with obvious expertise, tuning frequencies and conducting communications checks with the efficiency of someone who had used similar equipment extensively. Her radio calls followed standard military procedures, using proper terminology and protocol that impressed the Coast Guard personnel monitoring the frequencies. Master Chief Thompson found himself revising his assessment of Rebecca's capabilities as he watched her preparation procedures. "Sir," he said quietly to Morrison through the intercom, "she's not acting like a civilian pilot. Everything she's doing follows military standards." Rebecca completed her cockpit preparation and began the engine start sequence, her movements smooth and confident as she engaged systems in the proper order. The Huey's turbine engine began its characteristic whine, building power gradually as temperatures and pressures reached operating parameters. "Engine start complete, all parameters normal," she announced. "Hydraulic pressure normal. Electrical systems operational. Flight controls responsive." She moved the cyclic and collective controls through their full range of motion, checking for any binding or unusual resistance that might indicate mechanical problems. The sound of the rotor system spinning up filled the hangar as Rebecca brought the aircraft to operational readiness. The distinctive whop-whop of the Huey's rotor blades created vibrations that every military veteran recognized. But the smoothness of the startup procedure indicated that Rebecca had maintained the aircraft to standards that exceeded most civilian operations. "Flight controls check complete," she announced. "All systems operational and ready for departure. Requesting clearance for immediate takeoff on rescue mission." Captain Chun, who had been observing the preparation from the hangar floor, found himself impressed despite his initial skepticism. Rebecca's procedures were flawless, her aircraft preparation was thorough, and her professional demeanor suggested capabilities that went far beyond typical civilian pilot training. Lieutenant Commander Morrison conducted his own assessment of the cockpit instrumentation and found that while the equipment was dated, it was functional and properly calibrated. The navigation equipment was basic but adequate for visual flight operations, and the communication radios were compatible with Coast Guard frequencies. "Ma'am," Morrison said through the intercom, "I have to admit that your preparation procedures are impressive. But conducting a rescue mission requires more than just being able to start an aircraft. We're talking about precision flying in challenging conditions." Rebecca's response demonstrated the confidence that had carried her through thousands of hours of combat flying. "Commander, would you like me to demonstrate my aircraft handling capabilities before we depart?" Or would you prefer to evaluate them during the mission, when 8 lives depend on my performance? The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of questioning the capabilities of someone who was clearly more experienced than his initial assessment had indicated. Her preparation procedures had been flawless, her aircraft knowledge was extensive, and her professional demeanor suggested competence that exceeded many pilots he had worked with. Chief Rodriguez approached the aircraft and spoke to Rebecca through her open window. "Ma'am, we need to coordinate with other Coast Guard assets and establish communication procedures for the rescue operation." "Chief, I'm familiar with standard rescue coordination procedures. I'll maintain contact with your rescue coordination center and follow all applicable safety protocols. What I need from you is current weather information and the most recent position report from the Northern Pride." The efficiency with which Rebecca requested essential information while dismissing unnecessary bureaucratic coordination impressed Rodriguez, who recognized the prioritization skills that came from extensive emergency response experience. She was focusing on mission-critical items while avoiding delays that could prove fatal to the people they were trying to rescue. Master Chief Thompson found himself acknowledging that his initial assessment had been based on prejudice rather than observation. Rebecca's aircraft preparation had been conducted with military precision. Her procedures were flawless, and her knowledge of systems and operations clearly exceeded typical civilian standards. "Sir," he said to Captain Chun, "I have to revise my earlier assessment. This woman knows what she's doing. Her procedures are better than most military pilots I've worked with." Rebecca completed her final pre-flight checks and looked directly at Captain Chun through the cockpit window. Her eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had faced danger countless times and emerged successful through skill, preparation, and determination. "Captain, I'm ready to depart immediately. Every minute we delay reduces the chances of successfully rescuing those people. Are you prepared to authorize this mission, or do you need additional demonstrations of my aircraft's capabilities?" The directness of her question forced Captain Chen to make the final decision about authorizing a mission that violated standard procedures, but offered the only realistic chance of saving 8 lives. Rebecca had demonstrated professional competence that exceeded his expectations, but the responsibility for authorizing the mission remained entirely his. As he looked at the elderly woman sitting confidently in the pilot's seat of the ancient helicopter, Captain Chun realized that sometimes leadership required trusting people whose capabilities exceeded their appearances. Rebecca Thornton had proven her competence through actions rather than credentials, and 8 people were depending on his willingness to recognize that competence regardless of its unexpected source. "Miss Thornton, you are authorized to depart immediately on rescue mission to assist the fishing vessel Northern Pride. Godspeed and bring them home safely." The rotors began turning faster as Rebecca prepared for departure, and everyone in the hangar understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when ordinary appearances gave way to extraordinary capabilities, and when professional competence emerged from the most unexpected source. The UH-1H Huey lifted off from Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak at 5:52 a.m., its rotor blades cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, as Rebecca Thornton began what would become one of the most challenging rescue missions in Alaska maritime history. The aircraft climbed steadily into deteriorating weather conditions, with Rebecca's hands moving across the controls with the fluid precision of someone who had performed similar departures under enemy fire in combat zones across 3 continents. Lieutenant Commander Morrison occupied the co-pilot seat, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to professional admiration as he observed Rebecca's flight techniques. The Huey responded to her control inputs with a smoothness that indicated perfect harmony between pilot and machine, achieved through years of experience that no amount of classroom training could replicate. "Kodiak Base, this is Rescue 7. Rebecca transmitted as they cleared the immediate airspace around the base. Departing their location at time 552, proceeding direct to coordinates 57 degrees 43 minutes north, 153 degrees 28 minutes west. Estimated time of arrival at rescue site, 37 minutes. The coordinates she recited from memory matched exactly with the Northern Pride's last known position, demonstrating the kind of navigational precision that impressed Morrison despite his extensive experience with modern GPS systems. Rebecca was flying using dead reckoning navigation, calculating heading corrections for wind drift and maintaining precise course tracking using only compass bearings and visual landmarks. As they flew northwest toward the rescue site, weather conditions continued to deteriorate exactly as forecasted. The ceiling dropped from 5,000 feet to less than 800 feet, while visibility decreased from several miles to barely half a mile as fog banks rolled in from the deeper ocean waters. Wind speeds increased from 25 knots to sustained winds of 35 knots with gusts reaching 45 knots. Rebecca adjusted her flight path to compensate for the increasing wind, making subtle heading corrections that kept the aircraft tracking precisely toward their destination despite the buffeting from irregular gusts. Her control inputs were smooth and anticipatory, reading the aircraft's response to turbulence and making corrections before the helicopter could deviate significantly from course. "Commander," she said to Morrison through the intercom, "I need you to monitor Coast Guard frequencies and maintain communication with the Rescue Coordination Center. Also watch for other aircraft in the area, though I doubt anyone else is flying in these conditions." Morrison found himself taking orders from a civilian pilot, a situation that would have seemed absurd an hour earlier, but now felt entirely appropriate given Rebecca's obvious competence. He tuned the radio to Coast Guard emergency frequencies and established contact with the operations center they had left behind. "Kodiak RCC, this is Rescue 7 Airborne with Rescue Coordinator Morrison aboard. We are proceeding to assist the Northern Pride with estimated arrival in 32 minutes. Request current status of the vessel and any updated position information." The response came immediately from Captain Chun's operations center. "Rescue 7, this is Kodiak RCC. The Northern Pride has deployed life rafts and abandoned their vessel approximately 15 minutes ago. Last known position unchanged, but survivors are now in 2 separate life rafts drifting with wind and current. Vessel has sunk completely. Wind on scene is 35 knots gusting to 45. Wave height 8 to 10 feet. Visibility reported as less than half mile." Rebecca absorbed this information without any change in her professional demeanor, though Morrison could see her mental calculations adjusting for the increased complexity of rescuing survivors from life rafts rather than from a vessel. Raft rescues required different techniques and presented unique challenges that would test even experienced rescue pilots. Acknowledged Kodiak RCC. Be advised that life raft rescues in these wind conditions will require multiple trips. We'll extract the most vulnerable survivors first, then return for remaining personnel. As they approached the rescue area, Rebecca began descending through the cloud layer that had formed over the ocean surface. The transition from clear air above the clouds to the turbulent conditions below was jarring, with the helicopter encountering severe wind shear that would have challenged less experienced pilots. Morrison watched Rebecca's technique for handling the turbulent air, noting that her control inputs were minimal but perfectly timed. She was reading the aircraft's response to wind gusts and making corrections that prevented excessive attitude changes while maintaining stable flight parameters. Her decades of experience flying in combat zones had taught her to distinguish between turbulence that required correction and movement that should be allowed to occur naturally. "There," Rebecca said, pointing through the windscreen toward a splash of orange barely visible through the fog and spray. "Life raft at 11 o'clock, approximately 2 miles. I can see a second raft about half a mile northeast of the first one. Morrison strained to see what Rebecca had spotted, finally making out the tiny orange dots that marked the survivors' positions. The fact that she had located them so quickly in the poor visibility conditions demonstrated situational awareness. That exceeded anything he had expected from civilian operations. Rebecca began her approach to the first life raft, flying a careful pattern that allowed her to assess wind conditions over the water while positioning for the most effective rescue. Operation. The waves below were significantly larger than the 8-10-foot forecast, with individual swells reaching 12 to 15 feet and creating dangerous downdrafts as they broke. Commander, I need you to observe the life raft and count survivors while I establish a stable hover. Also watch for any signs of injury or hypothermia that might affect our extraction priorities. The first life raft contained Captain Torino, his wife Maria, and their 2 children. Even from a distance, Morrison could see that the family was huddled together in the center of the small raft, which was being tossed violently by the increasingly rough seas. The raft's stability was compromised by the high winds, and it was clear that the survivors wouldn't be able to remain in the water much longer. Rebecca established a hover approximately 50 feet above the life raft, holding the aircraft in perfect position despite wind gusts that would have made the maneuver impossible for less experienced pilots. The Huey's rotor wash created additional waves around the raft, but Rebecca adjusted her altitude and position to minimize the downwash effect while maintaining the stability necessary for rescue operations. Kodiak RCC. This is Rescue 7 on scene with first life raft. 4 survivors visible, including 2 children. Beginning rescue operations immediately. Morrison opened the cargo door and prepared the rescue equipment, though the Huey lacked the sophisticated hoist systems that modern Coast Guard helicopters carried. Instead, they would need to use a rescue basket lowered on a static line, requiring precise positioning and timing to avoid injuring the survivors during extraction. Commander, I'm going to bring us down to about 20 feet above the raft. The basket will be more stable at lower altitude, but will have less margin for error if the wind shifts suddenly. Rebecca descended carefully, reading the wind patterns over the water and adjusting her position to account for the raft's movement as it rode the swells. Her hover was rock steady despite the challenging conditions, demonstrating flight skills that Morrison had only seen from the most experienced rescue pilots. The first survivor to be lifted was 7-year-old Sophia, who was small enough to be secured quickly in the rescue basket. Rebecca held perfect position while Morrison operated the winch, bringing the terrified child up through the rotor wash and spray. The extraction took 4 minutes of precise flying that left Morrison exhausted from the concentration required, though Rebecca appeared unaffected by the stress. 1 down, 3 to go in this raft, Morrison reported. The child appears to be in good condition, just scared and cold. Carlos was extracted next, followed by Maria Torino, who was showing early signs of hypothermia but remained conscious and responsive. Captain Torino was the final survivor from the first raft, and his extraction required additional care because he had injured his shoulder during the vessel's sinking. Rescue 7. This is Kodiak RCC. What's your status and fuel situation? Rebecca checked her fuel gauges while maintaining her hover over the now empty life raft. Kodiak RCC. We have 4 survivors aboard from the first raft. Fuel sufficient for second raft extraction and return to base. Proceeding to second raft now. The flight to the second life raft took only 3 minutes, but the weather conditions had worsened noticeably during the first rescue operation. Winds were now sustained at 40 knots with gusts exceeding 50 knots, while wave heights had increased to 12 to 15 feet, with occasional swells reaching 20 feet. The second life raft contained the 4 crew members from the Northern Pride, and Morrison could see immediately that their condition was more serious than the family members they had already rescued. The men had been in the water longer and were showing more advanced signs of hypothermia, with one crew member appearing to be unconscious or barely responsive. Rebecca's approach to the second raft required even more precise flying as the wind conditions had become severe enough to challenge the aircraft's structural limits. The Huey was being buffeted by gusts that caused altitude variations of 20 to 30 feet, requiring constant control inputs to maintain stable flight. "Commander, this is going to be more difficult. The unconscious survivor will need to be secured in the basket by one of the conscious crew members, which will take longer and require more precise positioning." Morrison watched Rebecca establish her hover over the second raft, her control inputs becoming more frequent and pronounced as she fought the increasing wind. Despite the challenging conditions, she maintained position with accuracy that allowed safe basket operations, though the physical demands of flying in such turbulence were beginning to show. The extraction of the 4 crew members took 18 minutes of continuous precision flying, with Rebecca making constant adjustments to account for wind shifts and the raft's movement through the increasingly violent seas. The unconscious crew member, Engineer Jimmy Kowalski, required special handling that extended the time over target and increased fuel consumption. Rescue 7, this is Kodiak RCC. Weather conditions in your area are continuing to deteriorate. Recommend immediate return to base. Rebecca checked her instruments and calculated fuel consumption against the distance remaining to reach Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak. The numbers were tight but adequate, assuming no significant delays or diversions during the return flight. Kodiak RCC, this is Rescue 7. All 8 survivors aboard and secured. Fuel sufficient for direct return to base. Departing rescue area now for immediate return. The flight back to Kodiak required navigation through weather conditions that had become marginal for helicopter operations. Rebecca flew a precise course using compass headings and time calculations, occasionally breaking out of the clouds long enough to verify their position. Using visual landmarks that she recognized from decades of flying in Alaska, Morrison found himself serving as co-pilot for someone whose flying skills exceeded those of most military aviators he had worked with. Rebecca's techniques for handling severe weather, her precision in difficult rescue operations, and her calm professionalism under extreme stress demonstrated capabilities that could only have been developed through extensive combat experience. Kodiak Tower, this is Rescue 7 requesting immediate approach and landing with 8 rescued survivors. We have medical emergencies aboard requiring immediate attention. Rescue 7, this is Kodiak Tower. You are cleared for direct approach. To the Coast Guard base, medical personnel standing by. As the lights of the Coast Guard base became visible through the fog and rain, Morrison realized that he had just participated in one of the most professionally executed rescue missions of his career. Rebecca Thornton had demonstrated flying skills that exceeded anything he had expected from civilian operations, conducting a mission that would have challenged the most experienced Coast Guard crews using the most advanced equipment available. UH-1H touched down at Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak at 7:43 a.m., less than 2 hours after departing on a mission that had saved 8 lives through a combination of professional skill, mechanical reliability, and the kind of courage that defined the best traditions of maritime rescue operations. The ancient Huey settled onto the Coast Guard base tarmac with the gentle precision that marked Rebecca's entire flying technique, its skids touching down so smoothly that several of the rescued survivors later said they hadn't realized they were on the ground until the engine began winding down. Medical personnel rushed toward the aircraft as the rotor blades slowed to a stop, their emergency equipment ready to treat hypothermia and injuries that could have proven fatal. If the rescue had been delayed even another hour, Rebecca completed her post-flight checklist with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout the mission, her hands moving across controls and switches in the practice sequence that ensured proper aircraft shutdown. She seemed unaffected by the stress of flying a 2-hour rescue mission in deteriorating weather conditions. Though Lieutenant Commander Morrison noticed that her flight suit was soaked with perspiration from the physical demands of controlling the helicopter in severe turbulence. "Engine shutdown complete, all systems secured," she announced through the intercom. Following military protocol, even though the mission was technically over. Aircraft configured for ground operations and available for immediate relaunch if required. Morrison found himself staring at the woman who had just conducted the most professionally executed rescue mission he had witnessed in 15 years of Coast Guard service. 2 hours earlier, he had dismissed her as a well-meaning civilian whose good intentions couldn't substitute for proper training and equipment. Now he was forced to acknowledge that her capabilities exceeded those of most military pilots he had worked with, including himself. The cargo door slid open to reveal a scene of controlled chaos as medical personnel began triaging the 8 survivors. Captain Torino and his family were conscious and responsive, though showing signs of mild hypothermia and exhaustion from their ordeal. The fishing crew members were in more serious condition, with engineer Jimmy Kowalski requiring immediate medical attention for severe hypothermia and potential internal injuries sustained during the vessel's sinking. Rebecca climbed down from the pilot's seat and immediately began assisting with survivor care, her movements indicating medical training that went beyond basic first aid. She helped medical personnel assess each survivor's condition, while providing detailed information about the rescue sequence and any observations that might affect treatment decisions. "The engineer was unconscious when we extracted him from the life raft," she reported to the lead paramedic. "He's been unresponsive for approximately 45 minutes. The captain's wife shows signs of moderate hypothermia but has remained conscious throughout. Both children appear to be in good condition considering their exposure time." Captain Chun approached the aircraft as the last survivors were being loaded into ambulances for transport to the island's medical facility. His expression reflected a mixture of relief, amazement, and professional curiosity about the woman, who had just accomplished something that military analysts would later describe as one of the most significant civilian rescue operations in Alaska. Maritime history. "Miss Thornton," he said as Rebecca secured her aircraft and gathered her flight equipment, "I need to express the Coast Guard's gratitude for what you've accomplished today. You saved 8 lives when our own equipment failed, and you did it with a level of professionalism that exceeded our highest expectations." Rebecca's response was characteristically understated, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone she had used throughout the emergency. "Captain, those people needed help, and I had the equipment and training to provide it. I'm glad we were able to get them all home safely." The humility in her response struck everyone who heard it. Most pilots who had just completed a mission of such difficulty and importance would have shown some acknowledgement of their achievement, but Rebecca seemed genuinely indifferent to praise or recognition. Her focus remained entirely on the practical aspects of the operation rather than its significance. Master Chief Thompson, who had initially dismissed the idea of using Rebecca's helicopter, found himself approaching her with an expression of professional respect that hadn't been present earlier. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on incomplete information, and I was completely wrong. What you accomplished today was extraordinary. Chief, you made reasonable assessments based on the information available to you. Military personnel are trained to be skeptical of civilian capabilities, and that's usually appropriate. Today was just one of those situations where appearances were misleading." Her gracious acceptance of his apology, without any attempt to make him feel worse about his initial skepticism, impressed Thompson even more than her flying skills had. Professional pilots who possessed her level of competence often displayed corresponding levels of ego, but Rebecca seemed genuinely unconcerned with proving her capabilities to others. Lieutenant Commander Morrison completed his own post-flight procedures and walked over to where Rebecca was conducting her final aircraft inspection. Despite having just flown the most challenging mission of his career as a passenger, he felt compelled to acknowledge what he had witnessed. "Ma'am, I've been flying Coast Guard rescue missions for 15 years, and I've never seen helicopter handling like what you demonstrated today. Your techniques for managing severe weather conditions and conducting precision rescues exceeded anything I learned in military flight training." Rebecca looked up from the engine compartment she was inspecting, her expression reflecting mild surprise at the comparison. "Commander, you're trained to operate sophisticated aircraft with advanced systems that make difficult missions routine. What we did today required older techniques that aren't commonly taught anymore because modern equipment has made them unnecessary. But those older techniques worked when our modern equipment failed. Where did you learn to fly like that?" The question hung in the air as Rebecca considered how much of her background to reveal. Her military service record remained classified in many respects, and she had spent decades maintaining anonymity about her combat experience. But the circumstances of the rescue mission had already exposed her capabilities beyond any possibility of concealment. "I learned to fly during a different era, when helicopter operations were less sophisticated, but more dependent on individual pilot skill. My training emphasized techniques that are still effective when technology fails or isn't available." Morrison recognized that her answer provided information without revealing specifics, a technique common among military personnel who had served in classified operations. "Ma'am, would it be appropriate for me to ask about your military service? Your flying techniques suggest extensive combat experience." "I spent 28 years in the Army, most of it flying helicopters in various locations around the world. When I retired, I came to Alaska because I wanted to continue flying in an environment that reminded me why I had loved aviation in the first place." The revelation that Rebecca was a military retiree with extensive combat experience explained everything that had impressed and confused the Coast Guard personnel. Her flying techniques, her professional demeanor, and her calm handling of emergency situations all reflected training and experience that civilian aviation couldn't provide. Captain Chen found himself dealing with questions that went beyond the immediate rescue mission. Word of the successful operation was already spreading through Coast Guard communication networks, generating interest from higher command levels about the civilian pilot who had accomplished something their own aircraft couldn't achieve. "Ms. Thornton, I'm going to receive calls from my superiors asking for detailed reports about today's operation. They're going to want to know about your background and qualifications. Is there anything you'd prefer I not include in official reports?" Rebecca considered the question carefully, understanding that military bureaucracy would inevitably generate scrutiny about her role in the rescue mission. "Captain, you should include whatever information is necessary for accurate reporting. My military service is a matter of public record, though some operational details remain classified. Would you be willing to meet with our investigators to provide a complete account of your military experience? It would help me answer questions about how a civilian pilot was able to accomplish a mission that challenged our assumptions about equipment requirements." "I'm willing to cooperate with any reasonable investigation, Captain. But I'd prefer that the focus remain on the successful rescue rather than on my personal background." Her preference for anonymity was consistent with everything the Coast Guard personnel had observed about her character. Despite having just accomplished something remarkable, she seemed genuinely uncomfortable with attention and recognition, preferring to minimize her role rather than accept credit for the mission's success. Chief Rodriguez approached the group with news that would soon complicate Rebecca's desire for privacy. "Captain, we're already getting calls from local media about the rescue. Someone apparently recorded video of the helicopter departure and return, and word is spreading about a civilian pilot conducting the mission." Rebecca's expression showed the first sign of concern she had displayed all day. "Chief, I'd appreciate it if you could discourage media attention." I'm not comfortable with publicity about my flying or military background. But Captain Chun recognized that the story was too significant to remain private, regardless of Rebecca's preferences. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but this rescue will generate considerable interest. A civilian pilot saving 8 lives when Coast Guard equipment failed is exactly the kind of story that attracts attention." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several vehicles, carrying officials from various agencies who had been monitoring the rescue operation. The Alaska State Troopers wanted information about the civilian aircraft operation. The Federal Aviation Administration needed details about the emergency authorization procedures, and representatives from Coast Guard headquarters required complete mission reports. Rebecca found herself at the center of an administrative whirlwind that she had neither expected nor wanted. Officials questioned her about aircraft certification, pilot qualifications, insurance coverage, and dozens of other bureaucratic details that seemed irrelevant compared to the fact that 8 people were alive because of her actions. "Miss Thornton," said the FAA representative, "we need to discuss the regulatory implications of your rescue mission. Operating an uncertified aircraft on an emergency rescue mission raises questions about compliance with federal aviation regulations." Her response reflected decades of experience dealing with military bureaucracy and its civilian equivalents. "Sir, I operated under emergency authorization from Coast Guard officials who had the authority to waive normal regulatory requirements when lives were at stake. My actions were legal and appropriate under the circumstances." As the day progressed and the administrative requirements multiplied, Rebecca's desire to return to anonymity became increasingly impossible to fulfill. The rescue mission had attracted attention from levels of government that couldn't be satisfied with simple explanations or requests for privacy. Captain Chun realized that he would need to schedule formal debriefing sessions, prepare written reports for multiple agencies, and coordinate with public affairs officials who wanted to control the narrative about the rescue mission. The successful operation had become a bureaucratic event that would consume weeks of administrative effort. "Miss Thornton, I know this isn't what you wanted, but your actions today have implications that go beyond the immediate rescue. The Coast Guard, the FAA, and other agencies will need comprehensive information about what happened and why it was successful." Rebecca nodded in acceptance of the inevitable scrutiny, though her expression reflected resignation rather than enthusiasm. "Captain, I'll provide whatever cooperation is necessary, but I hope we can focus on using this experience to improve future rescue capabilities rather than just analyzing what happened today." Her suggestion that the mission's value lay in its lessons rather than its recognition impressed everyone who heard it. Even facing unwanted attention and bureaucratic complications, Rebecca remained focused on the practical benefits that could emerge from the day's events, rather than on personal recognition or vindication of her capabilities. As the sun set over, Kodiak and the rescued survivors received medical care at the island's hospital. Rebecca Thornton found herself transformed from an anonymous civilian helicopter owner into the subject of official investigation, media attention, and professional recognition that she had never sought and didn't particularly want. 3 months later, a delegation from the Department of Defense arrived at Rebecca's modest cabin overlooking Chiniak Bay. They came bearing the highest civilian honor for maritime rescue, the Gold Life-Saving Medal, and an offer that would change everything. "Mrs. Thornton," the lead official said, "we'd like to formally recognize your actions and invite you to establish a civilian rescue training program. Your techniques saved lives when our most advanced equipment failed." Rebecca set down her coffee mug and looked out at the waters where the Northern Pride had gone down. "I appreciate the recognition, but I have a different request." The officials exchanged glances. "What did you have in mind?" "I want you to fund a comprehensive training program for retired military pilots transitioning to civilian rescue operations. There are hundreds of veterans with skills like mine who could serve." remote communities if they had the support and equipment. 6 months later, the Rebecca Thornton Civilian Rescue Initiative had trained 43 retired military pilots across Alaska, providing them with aircraft equipment and coordination with local emergency services. Her old Huey became the program's flagship training aircraft, still bearing the scars from that stormy morning when 8 lives hung in the balance. Today, Captain Mike Torino works alongside Rebecca as a program coordinator. His family forever grateful to the quiet woman who proved that heroes don't announce themselves. They simply step forward when others step back. The truth Rebecca understood better than anyone is this: extraordinary people walk among us every day, hidden behind ordinary appearances, waiting for the moment when someone needs them most. Your neighbor, your coworker, that quiet person in the corner, they might just be the one who saves your life. The question isn't whether heroes exist. The question is, are you ready to recognize them when they say those 5 simple words? I can fly it. If this story reminded you that real heroes hide in plain sight, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What hidden talents might the people around you possess? Let us know in the comments below.